Hello, and welcome to Sonnetcast, William Shakespeare sonnets recited, revealed, and relived. I am Sebastian Michael, and this is Sonnet 7. Lo, in the Orient, when the gracious light lifts up his burning head, each under eye doth homage to his new appearing sight, serving with looks his sacred majesty, and, having climbed the steep up Henley hill, resembling strong youth in his middle age, yet mortal looks adore his beauty still, attending on his golden pilgrimage. But when from highmost pitch with weary car, like feeble age, he reeleth from the day, the eyes for duteous now converted are from his low tract, and look another way. So thou, thyself outgoing in thy noon, unlooked on diest, unless thou get a son. Sonnet number 7 is fascinating in that it employs a somewhat unsatisfactory, so as not to say unsuccessful metaphor to implore the young man to have a child, but it nevertheless tells us yet more about Shakespeare, his way of writing poetry, and the culture he works in. And in a moment we'll be delving into this, but first of all, what does it actually mean? Lo, in the Orient, when the gracious light lifts up his burning head, look in the east when the sun rises. Lo, sometimes written with an exclamation mark, sometimes separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma, sometimes, as in the original publication, quarto edition, simply part of the sentence, is an expression to draw attention to something that is worthy of that attention, that is either extraordinary or amazing or unusual, such as in, Lo and behold, the politician saw sense and retired from office voluntarily. It is interesting, therefore, that Shakespeare starts his 7th sonnet, 7th always in the traditionally known canon, if you like, with this very small, little, but powerful word to draw attention to something that is on the surface really quite common, the rising of the sun, the gracious light that lifts up his burning head. And he continues, each under eye doth homage to his new appearing sight. Each eye on earth, by implication, that's every human eye, which is both physically underneath the sun and also of inferior status, because the sun is, after all, the life-giving celestial body that effectively rules our planet. So each under eye declares its allegiance to this renewed and regular appearance of the sun, serving with looks his sacred majesty, and serves this sacred or holy majesty of the sky by paying attention to and looking at it. In other words, in the morning, when the sun's appearance is new and young, everybody is in awe of it. One thing that is worth maybe pointing out is the rhyme here between each under eye lifts up his burning head, each under eye doth homage to his new appearing sight, serving with looks his sacred majesty. To us this doesn't sound like a proper rhyme. Eye and majesty, they are quite different sounds, and that simply has to do with how the language used to be pronounced, how it was pronounced in Shakespeare's day. So in Shakespeare's day we can therefore assume that the pronunciation of majesty would have been majestai, to rhyme with I. There are several examples of this in these sonnets where a rhyme that would at the time have worked today doesn't seem like a proper rhyme anymore. The sonnet continues, and having climbed the steep up Henley hill, and having risen in the sky, the steep up heavenly hill is the arc the sun travels, and steep up simply means that it's steep in an upward direction. And note here that heavenly is pronounced with two syllables, henly. This, I've pointed out before, happens quite a lot in Shakespeare, that words such as even or heaven are pronounced with one syllable fewer than we would pronounce it today. We would always pronounce the V in there, and so we would say heaven and heavenly, whereas in order for this line to scan, it really needs to be pronounced as, and having climbed the steep up Henley hill. This happens a lot. This is not at all unusual in these sonnets. Resembling strong youth in his middle age, all the while having an appearance similar to that of its youth in the morning, even though it is now at midday, which is the daily sun's equivalent to a human being's middle age. Yet mortal looks adore his beauty still. Humans still look at the sun's beauty with admiration. Of course, the sun here being personified, and we'll come to that in a moment a little bit more. The yet here has the same meaning as nevertheless or even so, meaning that even though the sun is now in its middle age, we humans still find it amazingly beautiful. Attending on his golden pilgrimage, and in doing so, in looking at the sun, human eyes attend him in the sense of a servant attending on a king, reverentially and subordinately. The golden pilgrimage reminds us that this is no earthly or mortal king, no human king that we're talking about. We are talking about a sacred majesty. It is effectively divine. But when from highmost pitch with weary car, like feeble age he reeleth from the day, but when he, the sun, with his tired carriage, the horses in a horse-drawn carriage are being taken as read here, in an age when there were only cars with literal horsepower. Maybe there were also some donkey-drawn carriages, or maybe even some human-pulled rickshaws, although I think in England not so much, but no motor car. So the tired in the tired carriage refers to the horses, of course, that pull this carriage. And so when the sun in this tired carriage careers or staggers or indeed reels from the zenith, from the highest point, from the apex, which is midday and therefore stands for the day itself, now moving down toward the evening, looking and seeming like feeble age, like a weak old man, then the eyes for duteous now converted are from his low tract and look another way. These human eyes, which before were dutiful, are now averted. Converted is an old version of the same word, meaning turned away from the sun's path, as it now lies low in the sky. And they do what averted eyes must do. They look another way at something else, by implication something more beautiful than this sun, old as it is now, something more majestic, more powerful, altogether more interesting. So thou, thyself outgoing in thy noon, in the same way when you yourself are beginning to leave the daytime of your life, midday, the high point of your life, and start to move out towards the evening of your life after you've reached the high point around middle age, the evening being your old age, unlooked on diest, unless thou get a son, will die without anyone paying the least attention to you or even looking at you, unless, of course, you do as I've been telling you for 7 sonnets now, including this one, and produce a son. So the young man is presented with the example of the sun that rises in the morning, beautiful and bright, new and fresh and young, and in its majestic, even sacred appearance, it commands the attention of everyone beneath. Every human eye is compelled by this brilliant and powerful presence and willing to pay attention to it and even serve it. We might today perhaps speak of sun worship, although we might mean something quite different with that word, but you get the idea. But as the sun descends from its highest point at noon and moves towards the evening, it weakens in power, it begins to look and feel like an old sun compared to its fresh youth in the morning, and as a direct consequence of this, people lose interest in it, but also respect, and far from attending or let alone serving it, they simply look another way. The argument thus established, the young man is then told that this exact same thing will happen to him. While he is young and enjoys the full brilliance of his beauty, people, of course, look at him and pay attention to him and behave in a manner that is dutiful, even servile. Remember, perhaps in parentheses here, that we have fairly much established that the young man is of a high social status. He is, in all likelihood, a nobleman. I will be emphasizing this every so often, that we're talking about likelihoods here. We very often aren't able to talk about absolute certainties, but you will also hear me say more and more during the course of these elaborations that in the absence of certainty, likelihood is our friend. If we don't have any proof, if we don't have any absolute certainty, and there really can almost be no absolute certainty about anything, well then a great level of likelihood really is something to hold on to, because these pointers, these indications, these snippets of evidence, they do add up. This just in brackets, because when we say that people might behave in a dutiful, even servile manner to this young man, that would presuppose, of course, that he is of some aristocratic, or at any rate, high-level status in his society, which is very hierarchical. But as he loses his power and his status, and most certainly also his beauty, people will lose interest in him because he himself will no longer be much to look at. But also, and this is not unimportant in this context, of course, his name, his estate, his standing in the world will be substantially diminished unless he has a son who can, as we have before, carry on both his beauty and also, very significantly, his name. Now, the reason the metaphor doesn't quite work is twofold, really. Firstly, one could argue, and from a contemporary perspective we almost certainly would, that the sun is just as beautiful in the evening as it is in the morning. Although acknowledging that this is a contemporary perspective may be crucial, because we have noted before that these sonnets tell us something about how closely enmeshed with the seasons and the cycle of life human existence is in Shakespeare's day. And this certainly also applies to the perception of the sun. The sun is a life giver, it is the source of energy and sustenance, and it is extremely mighty during the day. Its majesty, its power does, however, absolutely wane in the evening, and so we should not be surprised that in an age before tourism, before beach holidays, before leisure time in a contemporary sense, or holidays as we understand them today, people did not pay anywhere near as much attention to sunsets as we have been doing more or less ever since the Romantic period, which peaks roughly 200 years after these sonnets were written. The second aspect in which the metaphor doesn't quite stack up is that the sun does not, of course, produce any offspring. It simply sets in the west and then it rises again in the east. The sun's new appearance is just that, a new appearance of the same old sun. If we felt so inclined, we could be a little pedantic and furthermore point out that actually doing homage to the sun's new appearing sight by serving it with looks is ill-advised. If you look at the sun directly, then, as now, you blind yourself and do potentially severe damage to your eyesight, so it's not recommended, and people tend not to do it, neither now nor then. And so the question, when we have in front of us a well-structured and predictably well-composed poem that does, however, fail somewhat to convince on its own internal logic, is, once again, why? Where does this come from? What prompts Shakespeare to write this sonnet in this way? And as we have been saying, and as you will keep hearing me reiterate often, We don't know. Certainly not for certain. But there are two mutually non-exclusive possible pointers towards an explanation, mutually non-exclusive meaning simply that they may well both apply at the same time, and for different reasons. The first one is a literary one, and this is as good a moment as any to observe, as many scholars do and often emphasize quite strongly, that Shakespeare, of course, does not compose in isolation. He is not an abstract intelligence that works entirely from within its own imagination. He is an English poet with, in all likelihood, and as everything we know about him suggests, a coherent education in the English tradition of the time, and that entails the classics, Roman and Greek mythology, including most specifically Ovid. Many parallels, many indirect or even direct references can be found in Shakespeare to Ovid, and classical mythology permeates Shakespeare's entire body of work. And so the concept of the sun as a god who travels across the sky, resplendent in a carriage drawn by fiery horses, is obviously not new. It's of Greek classical origin, and so employing it to make a rhetorical point is therefore also far from new. It's a standard rhetorical device. It's a trope, something you can take off the shelf, so to speak, and use in your argument. And Shakespeare's audience, for the purpose of this sonnet, we can only assume that the audience is this one young man. For him, for this young man, this commonplace of the sun as a god to whom one could be compared would have been instantly recognizable. There have been very little need for anyone to attempt a detailed analysis of this metaphor or to criticize it for its logical flaws. It would have been accepted as a stock reference, and its meaning would have been immediately understood. The second reason, and this may, as just pointed out, very well go hand in hand with the first one, is one we mentioned once before. If, as is entirely possible but as yet unproven, William Shakespeare did not write these first few sonnets in the standard sequence on his own initiative, but was in fact commissioned to write them, then his relying on a rhetorical device such as this makes perfect sense. He still has, as far as we can tell, no real personal investment in his as yet virtually non-existent relationship with the young man. So all he both can and needs to do is fulfill his assignment, which is to write poetry which will encourage the young man to follow the advice and counsel given therein. But you might say, if you are listening to episode 6 on Sonnet 6, which is really about Sonnets 5 and 6 because they're a pair, did you not imply there that in the final couplet, in the last two lines, there is a hint of a more personal engagement, of a more personal note, a change, a very slight, subtle change of tone, when the poet says, "Be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to be death's conquest and make worms thine heir." Yes, I did say that, and I do believe that to be the case. And so it would really then mean that 7 is almost a step back or a step down from this, which should not necessarily surprise us, because after all, if I am a poet and I have been commissioned to write some sonnets to a young man whom I don't know personally, in an age before smartphones, omnipresent, pervading photography, where it's impossible to look somebody up on the internet, where I might only really know this person from their name, maybe having spotted him here and there, maybe having been shown a picture of him, and I am given the task to write some sonnets for him with the very specific purpose to make him see sense and change his ways and marry somebody so he can start a family. And there is then at one point a reason for which a more personal note finds itself into these sonnets. Then we do not necessarily need to assume that this is a linear progression, that this just goes up, up, up in one straight line, because within this group of sonnets, there may have been some shuffling done. We can be pretty certain that 5 and 6 follow each other because they just have to. They are written in that way. But we cannot be absolutely certain that 7 actually is in the right place in the sequence. And even if it is in the right place in the sequence, it is still entirely possible that something has already changed a bit, but I still have these sonnets that I need to write and therefore hand to the young man. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that we can and should allow for a degree of flexibility in the oscillation of this very tentative as yet relationship between William Shakespeare and the young recipient of these sonnets. Sonnet 7 then stands there a bit more than a third into the procreation sequence, and on the surface does little besides what it is meant to do. It does not seem, at least as far as we can tell or have so far deciphered, to contain any hidden message or meaning. It does not communicate any personal emotion. It does not break any boundaries. In fact, almost the opposite. It is a classically composed piece that employs classical imagery to make a classical point. It, in a sense, knows its own limitations and sticks to them. And in doing so, it shows us what these boundaries are and what the cultural context is within which it is being created. And that in itself may or may not be of significance. It may or may not be the poet signalling that he knows his place after all. Because remember, the poet at that point is not the world's most famous poet. Well, I don't know whether he's today the world's most famous poet, but that's really strictly true. But he's certainly the most important and most famous poet in the English language. But this is not the case at the time. At the time when Shakespeare writes these sonnets, he is not yet that famous, not yet that well known. He is not yet that successful. He is already getting some recognition, but he enjoys far from a high status, as we will recognize fairly soon, directly within these sonnets. And indeed, Sonnet 7 is not the only sonnet in this procreation sequence to do more or less this, to stick within its limitations, to be effectively nothing much more and nothing much less than a competent piece of poetry writing. But there will soon be some sonnets that categorically break this very strongly signalled mould. And so I hope you will join me again next time on Sonnetcast as we recite, reveal and relive the sonnets of William Shakespeare.